Not as much as you think, because they're immediate situation. I brought it. Explained it all to you, to avoid it all, mitigate it all, everything else, but I brought this up. So, why should I bother?
Yeah, well, I was too.
But that would be the simple
I'm gonna
solution.
set some
But
rules and then we'll turn it over.
talk about it.
Is it 6 yet?
I've got less than a minute.
Okay,
Well.
another minute or so.
See what their consultants have.
You're
to say.
live right now, so you can,
Whenever you.
whenever you start.
Oh, okay.
You guys didn't want, we want to make sure everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone. Welcome. This is bit of the planning board right here. Caitlin and Kayla are gonna, have I got that right? Caitlin and Kayla are gonna take over and kind of explain everything. This is what they do, and they do it very well. Anybody have a cell phone? Just turn that ringer off for me. I appreciate that. And if anybody wants to ask questions after, when you have Q and A's or whatever, please be respectful and one at a time. Otherwise, I'll step in. Okay. So, is Tara here? Tara, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. So Morgan should be able to as well.
Okay, Morgan, hi. Can you hear us okay? Morgan,
It's not posted.
there you are. He's coming in.
Here.
Just give me a nod or anything. Okay, and at some point, Tara, you will need to take over the screen for some slides or something. Is that correct?
Theoretically, I have it. I'm having a little trouble advancing the slides, but we'll get there.
Okay,
I'm here. I can hear. It just wouldn't let me unmute for whatever reason.
okay, sounds good. I can hear you now, Morgan. Thank you. Okay.
All right.
Caitlin and Kara, take over.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us here. I'm gonna try to figure out where. I feel like over here is the place to stand, right?
That's a good spot.
As long as you're near a microphone, so I know when to change the slide to.
Right there.
That's right there.
I am.
It's right there.
Right
Oh,
behind.
look, I'm surrounded by microphones, in fact, so I'm in good shape.
Perfect.
Thank you guys for having us here. So I'm Kayla Tavares. This is
Kathleen Moore, or Kat is fine.
and on the screen we have Tara, who you've been hearing. Tara, if you want to say a quick hi.
Hi, I know most of you.
So we're here tonight to talk about a project that we've kicked off in the spring, and now we're getting sort of to the meat of. And the project itself is a project to explore opportunities for how to make the housing you might want to see show up in Waterville Valley show up. Because I sort of worked for as a planner for a while, and one thing we end up learning is that regulations over time can start to get added to, change, and eventually you can get to a point where something that you might want to see happen as a community is hard to accomplish for somebody on the ground, or you don't sort of see a lot of good opportunities to address some things, particularly in this project, housing opportunities. And so our goal in this project, in the big overarching scheme of things, has been to really think about what it means to have a vibrant community in any place, but for you all in Waterville Valley, and how does who is able to live in the community impact that vibrancy of the community? How does it impact the businesses, and how does it impact sort of the whole of the place that you all are lucky enough to call home? And I feel very lucky that we've been sort of asked to come in and do this with you all. But so what I'm going to do is, over the course of this evening, I'll give you an idea of kind of how this will flow. And what we're going to do is we'll give you a little bit of an idea on some of the pieces that have led us here today. So what do we kind of see to be true about the housing stock in Waterville Valley? What have we been doing since we kicked this off in the spring? And what particular opportunities we found in the very exciting, I know it's very charming to talk about, but land use regulations, right? Where do we see that there might be some places where Sometimes a little change might open up opportunities, or there might be an opportunity to look at a slightly bigger change. And so what we're going to talk about tonight is we'll go over some of that background of how we got here, and then we're going to dig into 4 or 5 different options that are potentially things that could go to town meeting as a vote for changes in your ordinances. And so there's kind of a twofold purpose to this, right? Part of it is land use terminology can get a little clunky and it can get a little specific. So sometimes there's just a question of what does this actually mean, right? And what would this mean in your community? And so part of it is for us to make sure you guys understand what these changes are. And the other part is that we can hear really well from you all about what you think is exciting about these changes, what you think is a little maybe unknown about them, and if there's anything that's concerning to you about them, so that when you see them come forward, or some of them I would expect probably come forward to town meeting and the public hearing process over the winter for that, so that you kind of have an idea of where these lead to, and what is going to go before you all as voters is something that seems to fit in Waterville Valley. So that's kind of our goal tonight, right? Is to introduce the topics to you, make sure you feel like you understand what they're talking about, and then have a really frank conversation about how much they could do, what if there's anything concerning or strange about them. And we're going to sort of use this flip chart to just jot down some of the pieces we're hearing, because afterwards, our real work as the consultant team and in working with your planning board is figuring out where are the ones that are things you guys would like to see show up on that town meeting ballot. So that's enough kind of framing from me, and we'll kind of jump right in. So like I said, this is who we are. We're gonna, actually, I'm being totally scatterbrained. I'm gonna ask Kat to pass out, because we do have copies of this presentation. You might have friends, neighbors, somebody else at home who'd have an interest in some of this. So I wanted to make sure you all had a little something to take away, even just to keep the conversation going around your kitchen table.
Thank you.
And Tara, if you'd be kind enough to switch us to the next slide, I'm going to hand things over to Kat to talk a little bit about what we see sort of in the numbers, what we can recognize, what we know to be true about housing in the community.
Yeah, so first we'll go over some housing data. And this graph talks about units per structure, so what kind of house most people are living in. And you can see that almost 60% of housing units in Waterville Valley are 1 unit attached. So an example of that is a townhouse. It's when they're single family homes, but one of the outside walls is shared between 2 single family units. Next. And so this focuses on what year housing units were built in. And we can see from 1970s through the 80s is when the majority of housing units were built in Waterville Valley. And then things really died down in the 90s. And then 2010 to 2019, we can see quite a few more units are built. So housing costs, this breaks down rent per month for renters within Waterville Valley. And we can see about 58% are spending $1,000 to about $1,500 per month on rent. And then about 40% are $500 to $1,000. So home value, you can see up at the top, we have median sale prices. So for Waterville Valley, it's about 1.3 million. And then the Grafton County median is 360,000. And then we can compare that. So that's the median sale price. And we can compare that to median home value within Waterville Valley. And we can see a majority of houses are in the 300 to 500,000 range, but a few are a little bit less. This is also 2021, and we know the market's been doing a lot of things over the last couple of years. But yeah, about over 25, almost 30 of the houses within Waterville Valley are in that 300 to 500,000. So a little bit on employment, you can see by the two bars in the middle that the industry of the occupation is really focused for residents of Waterville Valley. The breakdowns are sort of general. So we can see here, this is professional, scientific, management, and admin. And the other one that is 35% is education, healthcare, and social work. So that makes up a majority of residents in Waterville Valley. And because of it being a resort town, it's worth noting that almost 15% are arts, entertainment, and recreation.
What percentage are retired?
I'm unsure of that number. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's,
Significant.
yeah,
Yeah.
a significant number.
Well, I mean, that, if we're gonna talk about the spread of how people work or don't work, wouldn't that be an important number?
Yeah, so that chart is focused just on who is employed
Okay,
within Waterville Valley.
Is the data from the census?
Yes.
Okay, so.
So also,
The caveat that goes with that locally, right, Jonah?
Well, yeah, I mean, so is this, when you're looking at those percentages, are those of the 524 full-time residents that were identified in Waterville Valley?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah,
So it's not all property owners, it's
yeah,
it's the people who are identified by the census, which is different than our full-time resident list. Because we keep a much more detailed list. Okay. It was only the people that were picked up in 2020.
2021,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
2020,
yeah,
2021.
so that-
Yeah, it gets adjusted each year by the state office of employment.
Right, well, it actually gets adjusted at the federal level,
Oh.
right, yep, and then, but to your like overarching point, right, is. It catches the people who are here at a certain date when they're doing the census count, so you might have particularly snowbirds or people who you know are actually sort of primarily residents here. Who may not always show up that way on reporting forms, and to your point, you guys have more detailed information on that piece.
Well, and then there's the whole transient and the whole non-resident residents. You know, we have a big mix. And unfortunately, percentage wise, those are significant for the community.
Yeah.
Right, so. I just want to make sure everybody understands when, because that goes to.
no, I understand what they did, I just think that. The percentage of people that are retired, that are residents. Is significant. Let's put it that way,
Mhm.
probably,
Majority.
But some of those.
yeah, I would say that if you put that on here. It would be the highest bar, by far. So that this is kind of. Misleading.
Well, this is sort of only, the point to be made on this actually sort of comes nicely when Kat talks about this slide here on the commuting, because. One of the pieces that we see on that, the reason we sort of zoomed in there on folks employed here is there's a little bit of, I'm gonna call it a mismatch, right? Of the folks who live in Waterville Valley. For the most part, probably don't work for those jobs in the community, right? They're probably working for it somewhere else remotely or in a different place, right? Looking at what that concentration is. But we know that the majority of people who commute into Waterville Valley are commuting in for jobs that tend to pay different wages than what we see the residents here. That focus in those admin, scientific, professional, those tend to be higher paying wages. So to your point, I think it's like just a sort of like a different point, right? The majority, I would agree with you, are probably
I mean, that's
retired.
my issue with what was presented,
Yeah,
that if you wanna say, what do people do here? That's a bar that's missing.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Retirees is the vast majority.
So yeah, as Kayla mentioned, who's commuting to work here. So this first bar, that is 672 people or workers, are coming into Waterville Valley. So they're employed here, but live outside of the town. 97 are employed outside of Waterville Valley, but live here. And the 6 is both, so they live in Waterville Valley and work here. And then this focuses on where those people are coming from to work here and how long they're commuting to get here. So on this map, if you zoom in, it appears more as a heat map. But the purple and white dots show where people are coming from to work in Waterville Valley. And the pie chart gives a breakdown of their travel times. And so you can see 38% are within the 10 to 24 minutes, but also there's still 18% that are traveling more than 50 miles to work in Waterville Valley. And just to note, you can see some of the white dots on the edge here. There were more farther out, but so we could focus in. Okay, income, since we're talking about workers. So this is by household, and the biggest percentage, about 23%, are within 50 to 75,000. And another significant portion are 75 to 100,000. And then it's also worth noting to the far side is 200,000 or more, and there is a significant portion within that. But the median income is about 83,000 per year. And then this is just a breakdown of monthly earnings. So we can see that the majority is 1,250 or less. And the average weekly wage is $644.
These are all earned income, right? You're not talking about investment income or
Yeah.
Right.
annuities or anything. This
Right.
is work.
That's where the retirees.
Right.
come in.
Retirees
Majority of their-
would skew all of this
Right.
significantly.
So,
Can I just ask one question? There was a slide that showed the rents. How does that take into account someone whose mortgage is paid off? Like what, I know it comes out of the census data. But what are they measuring? What they're spending on housing or what they're renting?
well, so that's specific for if you're filling out the census form and you indicate that you're a renter,
Yeah.
it's just your rent payment. So it's sort of blind to the owner behind and like the mortgage status of the building.
Okay, so that's only the people that are renting whatever.
So
Yes,
people
so
like me,
homeowners, yeah,
people like me that own their own home
Is not.
Yeah.
are not included.
right, is not in that chart right there.
Yeah.
Right, that's rental data.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's the way I interpreted it,
Okay,
which is.
just wanted to.
Absolutely. So some of those data points we're going to talk about, they kind of will come up as we start to talk about why some of the opportunities we're going to get to fold in place, right? And some of the pieces, I'm going to sort of make a overarching comment on what I see in it is that what I see is that the profile of the resident of Waterville Valley is quite a bit different than the profile of the person who works in Waterville Valley. And you see some nodding heads and a laugh even, right? So sort of like a duh comment from me, right? But what's interesting about that is that when we were doing our outreach and working with the businesses, we were really trying to figure out or talk to people about this idea that a vibrant community is one where people feel like the businesses are open and they're growing and they're thriving. And that's a sticky point sometimes in this community that I heard. And one thing we realized there is that as people commute further away, as they're typically earning wages that are less, right? They're most of the employment in the community tends to be tied to that recreation resort piece, that we tend to start seeing that those renters and employees who work in the community might start finding it harder to come to work here, and harder in the sense that it became easier to maybe go somewhere else, right? And so we get to this place where we realize those employees being able to get to work easily, not feel like they're spending a lot of money on gas or commuting a very far distance that's now makes it very hard to juggle childcare pickup and coming to work and whatnot. You start to see that having an opportunity for there to be more of the workforce of Waterville Valley to live in Waterville Valley is a way to see that sort of whole picture of vibrancy get a little bit less tense and a little bit less limited in the community by making it a little bit easier for people to stick in those jobs that we see. We heard a decent amount of turnover, wage competition, and just people who start to struggle with commuting in for the work. So that in conversation is a little bit of what you'll see in the bullet points there of what we heard from some of those businesses. So over the summer, we did key informant interviews, which is a phrase Tara hates that I use because it makes it sound like people are like in criminal activity. So really, we just talk to people, right? And so we talked to people as business owners, business managers about what it is that they think would help them see that vibrancy step up a notch in their operations. Do they see an issue with employee housing, and what does it look like from them? And we heard a lot about that there's a lot of need for deep, consistent staffing, right? And people that they can count on, somebody to step up into a manager role and be able to really bank on them. That businesses feel like they start to cut shifts and not expand, or have to make some tricky decisions about keeping employees or trying to recruit employees and figure out how to sort of make the operations of that business really work for them. And a lot of people, did see that tied to housing and thought that seeing more of that opportunity for there to be housing that their employees can be part of the community, not just from 9 to 5 or whatever their shift is, but more permanently, is something that they thought would really sort of help in the full picture of things on their point of view. Some of them are pursuing solutions of their own, right? And as community members, you all are probably more familiar with those than we are, but we got a little bit of a glimpse of some of the lodging establishments, for example, that will turn a few rooms of their hotel into a place for the housekeeper, because as it was said to me very bluntly, losing one room to have the housekeeper in it still helps me because I can turn over my other rooms. If the housekeeper lived in Campton and wasn't going to drive up because the roads got snowy, I can't rent any of those rooms. So I have to start pulling off some of my units offline, housing my people to keep the other parts going. And so it's interesting to see sort of the innovation that people have, right? And that innovation, when we're in this room, as members of the planning board, but as members of the community, it starts to bring you back around to think about how do you make the opportunity for people to solve these solutions a little bit easier? Because you have creative problem solvers, right? Everyone does in their community. And with the right opportunities to do it, you'll see some of those solutions move forward a bit. And it might not be something that everybody individually pursues, but as a whole community, you can look at it, listen to those voices, and try and see where are the places where we might be able to make it a little easier, or we might be able to adjust some of this to see those problem solvers have an easier time doing that, right? So we can probably switch to the next slide here, but the costs of rentals and real estate are sort of at the heart of the challenge, it seemed like, to a lot of the employers, and part of the sort of motivation behind us doing all of this exploration here. Rick.
I just said, were you able to get any kind of historical perspective? Like, so when I first started coming to the valley, I don't know, whatever it was, 14 years ago. Everybody was fully staffed, everybody seemed happy, there were employees all over the place. So what were the triggers? I mean, certainly property values seems to be one, and rents are a pretty good one, but was there a change in also people don't want to be changing beds out at the hotels anymore, because with COVID came this sort of like, I don't need to be doing this anymore. I could do something else and be paid more money.
Yeah.
So was it before that, or is it really COVID kind of drove? The pandemic drove a lot of this change.
I'll sort of tell you how I see it, but I'd welcome anybody else to.
I,
Chime
so
in.
so you didn't get that kind of,
We got a little bit of a background. So there were a couple of people I talked to who spoke about a time when. And now this is when I'm going to air that I don't live in Waterville Valley. So I'm probably going to say a name of place and you're like, that's not the place. But I think it's the Golden Eagle. And a couple of other different developments that were called out by name of, those used to be places where people who worked in the community lived, and they've changed hands. And so part of it, which is the longer looking back piece, is that there's been changes of use of some of the units that used to be kind of employee housing. Maybe not formally tied to your job, but where there were condo units that could be purchased for, say, 120,000 15 years ago. Those we all know are long gone, right? And that has been a market change that seems like it's been going on for a little bit longer. But the second piece you said, I think, is also very true. And that's in COVID. And also, I think in the future, we start to see that there's a lot more competition for workers. And so to your point, right, if you're living in Camden, you might start being like, geez, am I really going to go up for that housekeeping job? Or am I going to start looking at a job in Plymouth that's going to be a little easier to get to, easier for my kids to get to daycare, and maybe I'm going to get paid a higher hourly wage, right? So I think there is some like, do I really have to be doing this? There's been certain change that is absolutely COVID, but I think that what I did here is that there is a little bit more of a longer track record of heading towards this, with changing over of the use of some of the places that used to feel like affordable landing points.
so do you, I think I asked this at some other meeting a while ago, but do we have data on the shift to short-term rental? With things like, I think Mark, you might have pointed out, like, we always had rentals here, it just was done differently. So all mountain rentals,
Rental,
yeah,
pool is probably smaller now than it was. I think a lot at the pandemic, it was starting a little bit before, but it was exacerbated by the pandemic. The people bought units. Instead of having them available as a seasonal rental, where maybe they used them in the winter and then had a seasonal rental in the summer, those are pretty much gone.
yeah, like that might have been. an
Now
employment.
they're using it year round. So I think that trend has certainly changed.
Okay,
And people buying, whether it's in a regular townhouse type development like Windsor Hill or something like that. I think now, instead of being an investment property, property owners are using their units more. And part of that is the increase in full-time. But it's also a bunch of people that are residents somewhere else, but they're spending more time here. And that really cuts in, because when I first got here,
different.
there was an availability of, a 3-bedroom townhouse that was affordable. And that's where our family spent 12 years, but that's not possible now for new people coming in. And it's not just a seasonal person at the ski area, it's professional folks, our workers that have licenses, they have families. And they're looking for a home, not just a place to come in for 6 months and do a short-term rental. Those properties are not attainable now, because they're in the $400,000
Or more.
or more, and nobody that we're gonna employ can afford that.
I think too, I mean, this is just an impression anecdotally, I don't
Yeah.
have any data to back it up, but it seems to me, say, other than the municipal employees, it's the nature of the jobs here that also account for the unaffordability. Retail and service aren't among the highest paying jobs. Now, wages have gone up because of the supply and demand, right? Lack of people to work, but you just don't make a lot of money
And the
retail
pressure
or
is
service.
exacerbated because property values are rising
Right.
in the surrounding communities
As well.
Hampton,
Hampton Thornton, a prime example.
they're jumping. Our neighborhood in Thornton has increased 50 to 75% in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
In property value.
The other thing that I think is happening is if you, those of us that live here. If you look at that which is being built. Where I live, for example, you all know where I live. All right, those are all $1 million homes.
Right.
All right, and just, I think everybody knows, the ones, most of the people that are. Matter of fact, of the 9 that are there, all right. None of them are living there.
Right.
They're all, I mean,
Second-
I sit here and shake my head, $1 million vacation homes, and that is. What I understand. Of
We're a
the
resort.
12 that are gonna be behind, at least 10 of those. Are also gonna be $1 million vacation homes. I don't know what's happening with the villas, but I can only talk about,
That's what Caleb, I think that's.
yeah,
what
I
we're
mean, these are,
looking at, right, is
that's what's
Yeah.
being,
What's being built.
that, as well as the homes that are being built here are. Nice.
And I think
Yes.
we gotta look at our, we have to look at our regulations and how
Okay.
that's being encouraged rather than some more affordable type of housing.
There's no way to build it.
This is the nature of the beast. We're a resort community. We're not a typical
Yeah.
northern New Hampshire town, and we suffer maybe on a smaller scale, but nonetheless suffer the same as they do, say, in Vale or some of these other very high priced areas.
I've been a long time when I was younger on Martha's Vineyard, and it reminds me of Martha's Vineyard in that same sense of there's a resort, like a resort piece has its own motivation, right? It has its own sense. There's a sense of place that comes with being a resort community. There's all the amazing amenities. I was listening to the talk about cleaning up cross-country trails and looking at the painting back there and realizing, there's all of those pieces that make it so wonderful, but at the same time, you need that sort of engine of a workforce to keep it thriving at the same time, right? And when we look at what's getting built and the costs of things, it's clear to know that markets have huge power, right? Especially as there's an attractiveness and a draw to Waterville Valley, it's likely you see those prices continue to stay that high, right? And in a lot of senses, I think as a community, you probably love to see that because that's sort of that resort community vision, right? Is this place where you have this influx of people who are coming in to really celebrate this place, a core of people who are really here as its whole, and then a backbone of a workforce that's really making sure it has those opportunities for everyone to get what they want to out of it. And so there's only so much control we have over the market, right? I'd love to think I had a magic wand that I could suddenly just say, oh, those $1 million condos are so beautiful. Let's start selling them for $325, right? But
I think you,
I'd buy
yeah,
for you.
I think we have a few people pissed off.
I think I'd have more than a few, right? And so it really becomes, like Mark said, about making way and looking at sort of how we can do things to bring down the cost, because we know that that market is going to continue to go as the trends have, right? But in the meantime, we need to make sure that the pieces that the market doesn't drive solutions for are those workforce ones, right? And so that's the reason we kind of hone in to say, how can we do anything we can really sort of chip away and chisel away at the little edges of making it a bit more affordable, a bit easier, and see what we can sort of open opportunities for. So let's get into the meat of things, right? Okay, yes, I was skipping over this, so I'm going to come back to it. So there's a few steps, like I was saying, that have gotten us here today. So we did a review of the zoning ordinance. So Tara and I both took some time and went through and did an audit of your land use regulations to think about the things that as professional planners, we see time and time again can sort of be either clunky or maybe there's an opportunity for something to be a little bit easier. And we did kind of an audit where we looked through everything and said, okay, where are the places that there is a chance for something to move forward, right? And then we put that as kind of a menu of ideas for the planning board. From there, we talked about those a bit with the planning board. Some of them were easy to say, yes, we are supportive of. Others of them were a little bit more interested to check in on the town, what the townsfolk on, right? Because town meeting is where the change happens. So it's important to take the pulse of the community. And Maybe some of you did it in the room, hopefully so, right? There was a survey that went out in the early fall to dig into some of the change areas where we wanted to sort of know where the voters were at, where it was a little bit less clear potentially to the planning board on their own about where this is going to go, and us as consultants. So we honed in on those with the survey. We kind of tried to evaluate them to a bit. The planning board considered the results of those surveys, and that leads us kind of to where we are tonight to talk through these 5 or so areas that we think have some opportunity with you folks. Get excited. All right. Part 1. So setbacks in your HDR zone. HDR zone is your high density residential zoning district in town. So what we see here is that today, actually, I'm going to start with this. My sort of introductory piece is on the side, you see this, the idea. So this is kind of the concept we're taking to this, what this change like is embodied, is to adjust the setbacks in the high density residential zone to match the low density residential zone requirements instead of exceeding them. And this is a little bit more specific than that, but that's the general idea, is reducing the setbacks in your high density residential zone to match the low density residential setbacks in areas where those two zoning districts come up against each other. So if you're in the high density residential zone and you're surrounded by other high density residential, this wouldn't apply to you. But the way the rules sit today, and this is kind of what's in this table here, which I know tables are very exciting to look at, but what we see in this table here is that today what happens is that if you're in the high density residential district, you and your property, like we're saying, shares one of those lines with a low density residential zone. We actually see what happens is that we actually start asking those high density residential zone properties to have a bigger setback when they're near a low density residential piece than they would for any other zoning district they're near. And then the second interesting piece about this is we actually also ask them to be further than the low density residential zone is to itself. And so what we end up sort of creating when we do that is we create a situation where we take our high density zone. These are usually the areas that are close to your village commercial or your commercial 1 zones, and where you're really trying to sort of promote that tight, dense downtown. You end up making it harder to build on those lots and needing bigger setbacks than in other parts of town to do things, which is kind of a perverse incentive if you think about it like that, right? You're actually saying in your high density zones, you're going to have to be further removed from your neighbors than in your low density zone, which is kind of against the point of the goal of the high density zone, right? It's actually to start to build up that town center so you have that walkable dynamic core. And so what our proposal is along those lines is to bring those to match, right? Is to say, we're not going to make it easier, but let's just make it equal across the board, right? If it's 20 feet between high density residential and other high density residential, if it's 20 feet between your low density and your low density, let's just keep that 20 feet. Seems to be a practice that's worked, and we're going to get rid of that sort of backwards little hook in there that actually makes it harder to build out that high density lot than something else. And so in that case, we think that keeps it from being too impactful on the low density neighbor, because we're holding to that same standard they would be used to, seeing that 20-foot setback. But we're just going to try and really lean into that goal of the high density zone and say, let's bring that back in keeping with that zone as usual. And instead of sort of acting like it needs to be sort of more restricted or more encumbered or harder in there. And so that's with our primary pieces, right? Our primary buildings. Now the second piece, and so now you'll go with me here. We're actually talking about these bottom two lines, accessory buildings. So an accessory building, very fancy way to say your shed, your garage, your chicken coop, right? So they're the little buildings. Who has a chicken coop in Roosevelt Valley? Somebody does like that.
Are there any, is there any high dense, I'm trying to put the map of the valley in my brain.
Yeah.
And please understand, my brain is old. All right, I'm trying to sit here and say. How much high density land, other than what we may tear down in the future and rebuild? How much is left available?
I think very little, right? Don't we know that most of?
I think
I
none.
was gonna say, I believe most of the developable land is in your village commercial district, right?
I would guess that would
NC1.
probably be, I would guess that. There are some lots available in low density, but very few. And those are selling for a lot. And I don't think there's a lot of high density.
Yeah, but this doesn't
This-
impact low density.
But these, I
This is
understand.
high density, so it's.
I'm saying I don't know of much high density land available, do you?
No, but.
But it could be redeveloped.
Well, I have no problem redeveloping.
So if you
I was
redevelop,
looking
you
for
go from
short-term-
35.
I was looking for relatively short-term answers, but
Well,
obviously that's not the case.
I think
Okay,
that this
Yeah.
is aimed at redevelopment.
okay.
It is, and I think you're gonna find that a lot of them are, because, I mean, let's get the
Okay.
elephant in the room out,
That's what-
because you
I
you
have-
hit it
I have-
square on.
I have no problem with it as a redevelopment. I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
As a short term, not so much, but okay.
Yeah, well, and that's the piece, right, is, I'll be honest with you. Housing policy change is, it's a tricky thing to change, because, right, because you also, when you change it, you're also usually never the one who builds it, right? And so you're always sort of trying
Yep.
to open that opportunity, and in Waterville Valley, when there's so little land available for
begin with.
development, you really have to sort of take a longer term look at it and say, we're gonna do everything you can in the short term, right, which we know folds more into some other projects potentially kicking around, but you want to sort of open that opportunity for the longer term horizon, because communities keep going and going, right? They live on for a long time. And so as planners, even as sort of folks who cast a planning related vote at town meeting, you want to think about that. And in Waterville Valley, that's sort of largely where it goes because of the way the land is built. So yes, a handful of these are really sort of redevelopment-y. It is redevelopment in the whole sense, but it's also things like being able to sort of put an addition on, right? Maybe there's something that could actually build out and put another unit or two in if they had a little bit more leniency than when they first built out. And on the accessory building side, this actually goes around to an interesting piece. So I'm going to tell you kind of the impetus of why we like honed in on this particular piece is we had a really interesting conversation about how the community loves this sort of like interesting diversity of folks who call Waterville Valley home permanently or part-time. And this seems to be the sticking point. If there's a sticking point or a conflict point that comes about, it's things like people with stuff and nowhere to put it, and things like, geez, the cars and the snowboards and everyone's stuff is that there's nowhere to put things. And so we started actually hearing about this from a handful of different sides, from the idea that when employers are trying to get folks to come and sort of be part of the community, the idea of having storage space becomes important when you have kids with bicycles, snowboards, skis, and all of the things that come with all of your kids, or even just your active adult lifestyles. You start to realize that people want good storage space for their winter things, their outdoor things, even the car maybe, right, in a garage, but even a place to put the snow tires and the skis. And when you don't have those, people put them where they can. They put them on the front porch, they put them in the front yard, they put them in a stack, and then they become kind of an unsightly neighbor. And so actually having good storage buildings makes it better for the resident and better for the neighbor, right? And so looking at that, what we realized is that in that high density residential zone, accessory buildings have a notably bigger setback than other places. We go, that 35 number shows up again. So for that shed potentially, or, sometimes you'll see these, I think about sort of a townhouse style development or something you'd see in a high density residential. This picture of, the sort of like shared carports with a handful of little storage areas for different units. And what we see is that the normal setback for these accessory buildings, and we actually are going to side limit them. So these are really small. So we're actually talking very small. Your normal side and rear setbacks for 150 square feet sized accessory building in the high density residential zone, right, abutting any other zone, you have to be 10 feet away from the property line to put that in. Gives you enough room to not shadow your neighbor's property, gives you enough room to maintain behind it. is a little separation, but lets you sort of use the space to put in a pretty small building, right? We know based on the size of that, it's unlikely it's gonna be tall or they're small buildings. But again, when it's adjacent to a low density residential zone, we see that number jump up to our 35 again. So that makes it actually pretty tricky on the way lots are fit to put in one of those sort of storage or accessory or a shed or a place for people to put things in your high density residential zone, which I think feeds into sort of tension that might exist a little bit about one, having a place to store your things, but two, when you drive down the street and you feel like property down the road looks cluttered, it doesn't feel attractive, right? It can feel a little bit like, well, an unsightly neighbor. And so I think that our proposal here is very similar to last time. Let's just bring that down to what this normally is in most places. A 10-foot setback for an accessory structure. We're still going to have that size limitation on the accessory building. So you're not going to end up with some whole property line long accessory building that shows up along a shared neighbor's line or something, right? We're still size constraining them. So let's let them go just as close to the property line. They're no bigger than they were in the other zones. So why are we sort of making them be closer in? It's just when you do that, you start to realize every property has an area of it. We call it like the development envelope, where you can actually build on the property once you take the setbacks out. And the higher those numbers get and you start pulling them in, you start to see it really starts to close in on the area available for development. So we're going to switch to the next slide here where there's actually like an example of what this looks like. And I'm going to let Kat talk through our example.
So yeah, this is to visualize all the setback lines for in high density residential abutting low density residential. And so this red line is what's current, the 35 feet. And then this blue is the proposed side and rear setback of 20 feet. And the purple that's even closer is the 10 feet we're just talking about. And then this green one here is to show for your primary building, the setback of 20 feet. So helps to see all the lines.
Right, so like really what we'd be doing, right, is we're actually sort of saying that you, instead of having to come in here, and actually these squares are, this is from your GIS or your tax assessor's maps. And so these squares you see inside of, these are property lines running here. These are actually the footprints of the buildings where they sit today. And I think it's interesting to see that you actually are within the setback of some of these buildings as they are today, right? Where it's a planner's kind of a million times over quick. If it burned down today, could you rebuild it tomorrow in the rules? And this would be a no, right? And so this is something we think is a way to make it so that your high density residential properties can maximize the use of that land, because land is expensive everywhere. Land is absurdly expensive in Waterville Valley. And so making it so that you can maximize the development of your high density residential lets people share the cost of that over the units and what they're constructing, and gives an opportunity, right? It doesn't guarantee it, but it gives an opportunity to see there be some viability to see those prices come down, right? So.
Prices come down? I don't think so. Not
Even-
today's environment.
No, in the dream world, right? But I think in reality, I think I probably said that kind of very overly awkward.
Slightly optimistic.
So slightly, you're giving me more kindness. I'd say overly
Nice person.
optimistically.
No,
Because I think really what it ends up being is, it's less that what you're gonna see is that every developer, or potentially really any developer who comes in and says, geez, forget those $1 million condos, I'm gonna build me some very affordable apartment rentals. What a better idea, right? Like, I think we can all laugh and say that sounds like very few developers any of us have ever run into. But what it does do is it does mean that a business who maybe owns that property today, or might have some other use for it, somebody who already has a desire to see a property turn into housing can have an easier time doing it. I don't think we're going to shift the market and suddenly create this thing that happens, and that's why you're going to hear me probably say it until you walk out of here and it haunts you in your dreams tonight. Opportunity, right? It's really that idea of opening up opportunity so that if there are one or two people who do have an interest to see it, we can see that be a little bit more in reach for them. questions about what this means? Anybody feeling a little like shaky on this and you want to sort of? All right. So now I'm going to ask you sort of the more important question, pros and cons, like what do we see as sort of the benefits of this? Anything for or against you guys would like to sort of share with us to keep thinking about?
I'm puzzled with this existing setbacks, like 35 feet. I don't know why they were ever set. for
Protect
that.
LDR,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's-
protect LDR, to keep a larger building away from a single
Yeah.
home. That was
That's
clearly
why
the
it was done
intent.
that way.
Like,
Yeah.
I don't think any of us were here at the time that it was done, but I can understand that in the past. We're talking about different eras that are markedly different. But the old planning board would have said, I don't want to look at that guy's shed. So we're gonna make the setback 35 feet.
Well-
That's the sort of discussion that has occurred. This is for the argument of consistency, makes sense. But in today's environment, it's significantly different. The demand for land,
Yeah.
the fact that there is no land in Waterville Valley and it's a, a restricted size community. You can't just go out and, cut down trees and make more houses. It's not here. So it's incremental what you're talking about.
Absolutely. It is.
This is not,
No, we're not suddenly gonna. We're not sort of untying the issue of housing in Waterville Valley in one fell swoop here. I wish we were, right? But that's,
Has anyone done an analysis of the voter registration rolls as compared to living in LDR or HDR? or VC?
C1. You
Because
have
I
that,
think you
Mom?
find most of the voters in town are gonna be in LDR.
Yeah, the people who show up at town meeting,
All right,
largely
now.
LDR.
If you were to make all proposed changes, change all the zoning to the proposed ones. How much property would that actually open up to low density, to higher density building? How many houses or low income houses could we put in? How's that gonna change the climate in here?
that's a good question and one I don't have an answer for, to be honest. with
These
you.
are these are not necessarily homes. These are accessory use.
Yeah, the
Right.
10 feet drop down is
Right.
accessory buildings.
These are
yeah.
accessory use, not houses,
But the,
No.
theoretically.
but what we, I think one way to sort of back into is I'm gonna talk about how we kind of could figure that out. Fully acknowledging, I don't have an answer for you for tonight on that, is really looking at the number of properties in the high density residential zone. And there's actually a process you can do, but there's a tool sometimes we use as planners where it's called like yield planning, where you say, okay, this lot has 1.5 acres and you need this much housing for this, and you need this for this, and then you say, in concept, how many units could I fit on this lot if there's nothing on it, right? And you could actually sort of play that out for all of your high density residential to say, how many units could this possibly hold? But it's a little bit more complicated than that usually because everything's sort of already built and whatnot, right? So we could figure out for you all pretty quickly how many properties this would affect, but figuring out how many units it could open up is actually kind of, it's a little bit too hard to sort of tease in
Well,
each
it's not
individual lot bit, unfortunately.
But it's not now.
But the
As
answer
you
Reggie,
said-
is not.
as you said before,
So what is
the
point?
power of this is not today. It is redevelopment, not current development.
Yeah.
And in a redevelopment, there's some real power that you could do here. Which you probably can't do tomorrow, but if you chose to tear down. Pick a high density, if they all agreed to tear that down and rebuild, there's a lot more that you could do with it than you can do today.
And Reggie, I think that's the point.
Yeah.
It isn't anything
Today.
that maybe is gonna happen in our lifetime, but we're setting it up
Especially in my lifetime.
to make it more attractive for the future development.
Right.
And that's gonna be important because we have 98%, 97% of our land is already built out.
Mhm.
So
Have the
a
space.
lot of these things that we're looking at, we've got to take the eye for the future for the redevelopment.
You and I'll be dead, Reggie.
Is there anything that we could do that we could see happen in our lifetime? Well, there's other
Yeah.
proposals.
There are some others, so let's sort of. Let's keep moving forward, I say. You all ready for that? Okay.
All right,
Well,
Kayla, can I just hop in on one thing? So the planning board has had a couple of lengthy meetings to go through most of these and to refine them and get them to where the board is comfortable until we get to the cluster one. And I can't see like how many non-planning board members are in the room, but it's really important that we get the planning board's goal of the meeting, which was to hear from the public and get the public's response. So just maybe that's a little bit of a reminder to the planning board that we want to make sure and hear other people's thoughts on these tonight.
Thanks, Tara. So I'm gonna jump on Tara's piece and say, so if anybody on this side of the room has something they want to say they haven't said yet, you can always interrupt at any point, right? So these, we'll go into a few different topics, but it's different information. So if you want to circle back to anything, I like nothing more than to be interrupted because it shows me that there's something that's making it resonate with you or something we might be able to help on. So we'll come back to anything. We're doing a very similar thing. I promise these won't all sound like this because I know the number adjustment is a very tedious thing to talk through. But we're talking about something very similar now in the village commercial. So the idea on this one is to adjust the setbacks in the village commercial zone to match the low density residential requirements instead of exceed them. And this, I think, likely goes back to that same concept of when these rules were put in place. I agree. I think they sound to me like rules that were written to make sure that a low density property doesn't have something built too close to it on a neighboring property. But when I look at it, what I see is what we've asked is sort of not just an equal respect of low density to having a matching setback, but something more, which then makes it harder for us to build out that high density zone. So in village commercial, we actually see that same thing happen. We saw in the high density residential zone, right? Where we see a 20-foot setback for your principal buildings in village commercial. For comparison, in your low density residential, again, we have a 20-foot side and rear setback from the property lines for those principal buildings as well. But in your village commercial, again, when you're at the side or rear setback shared with your LDR, we see that 35-foot number come up again. And so this is literally the exact same change. That consistency is key, I think, in an ordinance as we're putting forward or talking about with the high density residential zone to bring those to that same matching standard where we go to a 20-foot setback for the principal buildings, which is what is required in that zone in all other places, is also the same setback we require in the low density residential zone. And then with our accessory buildings, we're following that exact same logic. So this really is that same concept just applied to the village commercial zone as well, because we saw it reflected there in the numbers too. Does anything about this feel different to you in the village commercial versus high density residential? I think what I sort of have heard in the room is, it seems like kind of a logical way to do something, but is there anything about that zone that makes you feel differently about this? Anything else we want to sort of talk about specifically with village commercial? So this is kind of one of those concepts. This is that opportunity piece, right? Of making it a little bit easier for that walkable, vibrant core Waterville Valley's master plans and aspirations have talked about for a long time. Really looking at what it is to make it sort of effective for people to build that up easier in those areas.
It's the same issue.
Yep.
It's in village commercial, what you're talking about here, a multifamily unit, just like an HDR. So there is no difference.
Same.
Yeah.
Well, is there, like, where does that border today anyway? Lowe's,
Lost, Moose Run. You have LDR with single family homes that butts up against VC
Is
land,
like
that would be one area,
the
as an
new,
example.
the new buildings, are those in?
The new buildings are in VC. And they border LDR.
Right.
How do the changes coincide with the plans that they're presenting for the changes that they want to make over in town square and so forth with the investors?
That's an awesome question. And I don't know if Tara, if you want to speak to that, or I think Tara's more familiar with the plan for.
Yes, my conversations with Terrell folks are that they would really benefit from several of the amendments that we're talking about tonight would help a proposal that they're looking at to build workforce housing near the town square.
But in terms of the conceptual plan that they briefed, that's in commercial.
That the conceptual plan they drew to match the existing zoning. They don't require any zoning changes for that concept plan. This is something else I was referring to that I met with them about recently.
So I don't know if we have to talk this one through, but here's a similar visual, right, of those exact same lines. We'll see. Now, because apparently we're really into setbacks tonight, I'm going to talk about another concept of setback, which is a little bit different. And I like different. What I like about this, I'll say out of the gate, is it's nuanced. And I like when something is sort of responsive to what's around it. And so this relates again to our village commercial zone. Where the idea here is to adjust the front setback. So if you go with me, on our last slides, we were talking about our rear and our side setbacks, and our front setback is that distance from the road. And what we're concepting out here tonight is to adjust the front setback in the village commercial zone on the land located across the road. I wrote that horribly. I don't even think that sounds like English. So let me say it to you in English, which is to have the setbacks in your village commercial zone match what it is across the street. So for example, if the parcel is zoned village commercial, but across the street is high density residential, then the setback you can use on that property can come just as close to the road as your neighbor across the way. It's an equal thing, right? We're not trying to impact each other too hardly across the road, but we're letting things match. And we're letting them come a little bit closer. And so what that would do is it would follow regardless of what is across the street from that property. So was that property, say, across the street from, so here we have this, right? If the village commercial zone right now, the front setback today is 35 feet from the road. But what you could see is if we brought this down to be this tiered idea of matching, so the table actually breaks out all of your zoning districts on what those setbacks are in the column, we can then see that you could actually bring this down to a 20-foot setback when it's across the road from C1. You could actually bring this down to 25 feet when you're across from your civic district. You can bring it down to 35. You keep it at 35 feet across from HDR and LDR, right? But we're actually kind of just making it so it's a little bit more adjustable so that we're not having one setback. And this actually goes to kind of a planning principle is as you're going down the street, you kind of want, if you want that feeling of that vibrant downtown, you want those buildings to feel equally close to you on either side because it creates a visual interest on both sides, right? You don't actually want something to be very far set back and then something here because you actually kind of, as a driver in a car, you feel that, right? You feel something coming close to you here and something further there. And in reality, you want to bring them forward to match each other. So why not in an area like village commercial, which oftentimes is up against other across the street, let it match so that we can have that consistency. Because as a member of the public, you tend to interact with those buildings most when you're driving down the street or walking down the road. And having that be similar on both sides is actually a really good placemaking strategy. So this is something we looked at as a way, creates a little bit more flexibility, and what it will do ultimately is that same piece of giving a little bit more of a development envelope on those places, but not so much that it becomes out of context with the whole street coming.
What's
What do you
hard for
think?
me is, as you discuss this, I'm trying to keep visualizing a zoning map in the core of the town and where village commercial is and so forth.
There you go.
And that map that we've seen for a couple of years about the long-range plan to redesign the town where the village road, I think, disappears.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to think, where are the roads that will be impacted by this?
Right, where
And
are we?
one Part of the road, there's a golf course on one side. So, it's hard for me to conceive of how this is actually going to play out. And conceptually, what you said makes sense.
Yeah.
But.
What does that look like here?
I can't see it in my head at least.
Absolutely.
So
So-
Kayla, I leapt ahead because these are actual pieces of the zoning map.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so I went online and took screenshots basically of different parcels in your zoning map, so it'd be real life scenarios. So the red line shows the current setback for each scenario of being 35 feet, what it is now. And then the green lines is the proposed setback, so BC across from LDR and HDR stays the same at 35 feet. BC across from Special Civic, small change to 25 feet. And then the farthest one down is VC from across from Commercial 1, and that changes to 20 feet.
Do you want me to go back to the table, Kayla? Were you all set with that?
I think we're all set with the numbers.
Charles, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It might help me if I knew where those three are.
Well,
It would be nice to have a map of the town where actually.
Yeah.
told
Yeah.
you, because I
Right.
understand
I was
what you're
gonna say.
saying, but I'm not
Right
knowledgeable. on it.
Rich,
Yeah.
so.
But what are the comments on there
Yeah.
about assistance? I guess
Can-
that's-
Yeah, absolutely.
Point to them.
Will you be our Vanna?
Yeah. So this is the far right. The one on the far right.
Okay.
So,
And so orient the map, show them, so that's right by Corcoran Pond, down by the athletic center.
Yep.
Where Rich is pointing right now, and it's across from C1. Okay, because the center of town is the commercial
Sure.
land, right? And then as you go around the corner, the second VC there. The next one up, Rich. There you go, right there. That's where the new condos are being built by Golden Heights Road.
Yeah.
And then that would be a change because it's across the street from C1.
Okay.
Okay, so right now there's a difference in the setbacks on each side of the road. And those are just examples of the areas where it fronts different zones.
Thank you.
Any likes or dislikes on this? Strange comments, weird questions? Thoughts on the day?
Makes sense to me.
All right,
A good argument for consistency.
I'm all about consistency.
No.
I'll tell you, I just spent a lot of my career in town halls in planning, and nothing drives you crazier than inconsistency, because you start looking back at things and you're like, wait, what happened? But
Well, I'll own this, that this is making something that's consistently 35 feet and making it inconsistent to be more of a chameleon to go with what's across the street from it. Because I normally like consistency, but
So now, should we? Yes, now we're gonna talk about something other than setbacks. I know we're all looking forward to that. We want something more exciting, parking. So. Parking, there's two different things we're gonna talk about around parking. One of them is about parking for accessory dwelling units, which accessory dwelling units are, they're basically they're apartments attached to a primary home. So if you, or basically have a single family home and then an accessory dwelling unit is another one that's in common ownership, but on the same property. A lot of times they're the granny flats or the little garage apartments that we sort of think about in concept. The formal name for those when we're talking about them is often an accessory dwelling unit. And so one thing we realized is that accessory dwelling units are a growing opportunity to get a lot more solution makers on board. Because when you think about things like multifamily buildings and things like that, there are very few residents themselves or people in your community who will likely go out and build those. But you have a lot of people who might think about putting an accessory apartment in or renovating a space that they have in their home today to provide one of these apartments. And there's been a great win-win we've been seeing really across, obviously across New Hampshire, because that's what I'm most familiar with, but far wider than that with accessory dwelling units recently, because one of the things that's great about accessory dwelling units as a whole, and you guys already allow them, so those are already a great thing happening, right, is,
State requires it.
well, there's that piece too, but you do so well with them. And the idea is that accessory dwelling units are great for sort of the person who lives in the main home, and they're also great for the person who lives in that smaller unit. They can provide rental units for a family or just a single employee or a couple to land in a community with a rental opportunity, right? A place to get into Waterville Valley. And then for that homeowner, they provide supplemental income. And while we do know that the incomes in Waterville Valley are pretty high, there are actually a handful of people I spoke to who said, you know what, but we own a home here. And if I could have something that was supplementing my income, I wouldn't shirk at that. That would be of interest to me. And so what we realized is that in the regulations today, dwelling units, a house, and they always require 2 parking spaces per unit. This is probably the most standard thing I think I've seen in any zoning ordinance I've ever looked at everywhere. It's always 2 parking spaces per unit, right? And what we ended up seeing is that we could potentially, knowing that accessory dwelling units are smaller in size, we could actually lower the parking requirement for an accessory dwelling unit. And that would actually make it easier to fit them on a property and a little bit less impactful on a neighbor visually, and even just how much of your neighbor's driveway is a car park or paved. It's got stormwater benefits in that too, right? And having less paved or gravel impervious surface on people's lots. But the idea is that oftentimes, because these accessory dwelling units, they're not 3 and 4 bedroom homes, right? They're size constrained, they're small. They typically have 1 or 2 residents in them, and potentially you could actually relax the rules for parking requirements to only require 1. And the trick here, I'll say, is your ordinance has a set of requirements. Your ordinance does not have a maximum, right? So were there 2 people with 2 cars, doesn't mean you couldn't then have 2 parking spaces for your primary home and 2 for your accessory dwelling unit. But you could lower it in the rules, makes it so that 4 spaces wouldn't be required every time. 2 for the primary and 2 for the accessory. Makes it a little bit more adjustable to realistic terms, right? It makes it so that the rules themselves, as written on the paper, require as little impact as possible. Doesn't mean you can't put 2, doesn't mean you can't put 3. Heck, I think when I was a kid growing up, we had a lot of kids in a household. I think we probably needed 6 parking spaces at a point where when we were all in high school. So it doesn't set a cap, but what it does is it lowers the floor, makes it a little bit easier. And in that sense, makes it a bit easier to fit them on your property. And makes them an easier neighbor to share too, which goes to that long-term piece. And anytime you start trying to invite new residents into a community, you have to think about what it means to the people who are here today, right? So I think this is a piece that goes towards walkability and sort of trying to keep things as low impact as possible in the rules themselves, right? Saying you don't always need 2 parking spaces. If you think 1 would be sufficient, you can go forward with 1. If you need 2, you can have 2. If you need 6, you could probably fit 6 if you need to. We think that this is something that could have basically just a good impact. And like I said, low density residential is a place where you have a lot more potential people who could be problem solvers because you have more property owners there. And making it as easy as possible for those accessory dwelling units, I think is just a good move on that piece. It also kind of goes towards the whole walkability piece that seems to be so sort of, I see that as pretty core to the vision of Waterville Valley. I see in your master plan and different pieces. And I think we always have to look at that balance of making things easy for cars or promoting things to be tighter and more walkable and how that kind of pans out. Lowering the requirements is one really soft way to start to do that.
Question.
Yeah.
A few minutes ago, we were talking about setback requirements for accessory buildings. These accessory dwelling units, are they in that category in terms of, are they considered, I'm curious how many places can fit an accessory building?
It's a great question. I don't believe that. I'm gonna just be honest with you, as
No.
I am not the,
They have to be attached.
yeah, they have to be attached, so then they would have the principal building setback.
Oh.
Thoughts on the parking space? Anything about that that sounds either really logical or really thorny?
I think it can be both.
Yeah. I think our idea here is very much about, and I literally just, I know I sound like a broken record. Sometimes I think it's important to hear things a couple times, right? But the idea on this one is really about making it easier, lowering that barrier for entry if you wanted an accessory dwelling unit. And then making it so that each property can do what's right for it at the end, but not making the rules always require the maximum be sort of built out for parking.
Why do ADUs currently need to be attached and not allowed to be not attached?
So New Hampshire statewide has a law that allows accessory dwelling units when they're attached to the principal home everywhere in the state. And individually, communities have to vote and amend their zoning ordinance to allow them to be detached. And that's just not something that Waterville Valley has taken a step for. So we're in that piece of, they're looked at sort of separately in regulation, just by the way the state has put them forward with attached. Harry, do you have
I don't
something?
think, sorry, I don't think you mentioned the visual impact here. That's the next slide of one car versus two.
Yeah, so we made this to show, you have the single family home and then the ADU. And you have to assume that the driveway is taken up by the two cars that are required for the single family home. So then it'd be two more cars taking up that much space on your lawn. So you imagine 4 cars. Yeah. Thanks for going.
I think I agree with, the sort of incent people who have maybe a desire and allow them to take advantage of this, but the walkability things, as a casual, just maybe not so casual observer of behaviors of our residents. There aren't a lot, there are people, what do we have, a 2 mile square town, and then people walk.
One,
Drive
less
to
than
the
one.
post office. From fairly close to the post office, so we don't get a lot of walkers, frankly, maybe it's. A lot of people drive here.
But more here than many places, let's say.
Yeah, because it isn't that big, right? But I would think that would be more. And I got into this with Tim a little bit about the walkability from the employee housing that they're contemplating somewhere else, that they would walk the town square, and I laughed at that because nobody walks. I shouldn't say nobody, very few people walk the town square, and where he was talking about, it was even further.
Yeah, I wondered about that too.
So,
Well, a good observation is that people who play tennis, who go to the tennis court so that they can run around for an hour or two,
Right.
insist on parking across the street from the tennis courts.
We carry multiple rackets and tennis balls.
Drop them off.
Never mind. You're absolutely right about your comment about people not wanting to.
But
walk.
yes, this is, it is not what you would think.
I think, well, I'll tell you one thing. I think walkability is one of those aspirations almost every community has. And then in reality, we all know that the second it gets cold, we're like, I'm gonna just drive over there really quick. And like, there's a certain piece to it. It's like, there's a behavior change that has to happen for like people to start walking to get places, right? And it's like, we behaviorally, very few of us have rounded that curve fully. And sometimes planners and communities start to push that, right? And nudge people towards getting a little more comfortable walking when that's an aspiration, because we all know that when push comes to shove, we're very car oriented people, right? This is America. We love the drive. And so it's always tricky when your aspiration is walking and like a walkable center, right? And you realize people don't really do that. How do you start to either make it a little uncomfortable to drive all the time if you really want people, make it a little easy, make it seem a little more attractive to walk, or, you know, there's a lot of coaxing that has to happen to get people to change behaviors like that. It's definitely not as simple as just, yeah, sure, we'll drop the parking space and now you're gonna walk, right?
I think most of it's about time too, though.
Yeah,
I think that's the number one culprit. I mean, I think carrying stuff is one thing, but I think people plan on it for so. It's limited, so
that's such a good
that's what I
point.
find out. I ideally want to walk everywhere, but. Mine is this time.
Right, and you're like, but I have 10 minutes to get there and get back.
That's a fair, I mean, I'm retired at this point, and so I have all the time in the world to go to the post office.
Yeah.
You might not, right?
Except,
get that.
except we don't, for some reason.
It's I'm retired, but I've never been busier.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So our offices are in Littleton and we moved from a place that had like its own parking lots to a place right in downtown a handful of years ago. And now we have no sort of designated parking for our office. And oftentimes you end up parking across the, you know, it's no, we're familiar with Littleton, but across the bridge and over in the park area. And I've realized, I'm like, I will occasionally be 10 minutes late because of it, but it also is like, it does get me out, it does get me walking. As much as I grumble, it is.
And it's a nice footbridge too.
Exactly. It's a nice place to sort of get out and walk around, and Littleton's leaned very hard into it, so I don't complain, but I know what you mean. If I could park right outside, I would. Any more thoughts on the ADU parking? Okay, no need to beat a dead horse.
Yes.
Yes.
And that, planning board not supposed to talk, but. One,
I don't belong on that.
yeah. I'll take your lead. There's no street parking anywhere in Waterville Valley. If you encourage people to build ADUs, where are they gonna park? This is a mountain town. Most of the dwellings are on a gradient. So you're gonna end up having problem parking on the street. That's, you know, I can understand. It's another one of these consistency arguments. And it's logical. But, you know, try to implement this in Waterville Valley, some problems are gonna occur.
Just had the situation.
Can I ask you guys, what does that look like today? Because I imagine that that's probably a problem that happens today with units. You know, is there an issue with people parking? Because ADUs are sort of one specific unit, right? But I'm just
Sure.
curious, like the topography, the development patterns and no parking on the road. Is there like an enforcement piece that this comes about? I also think about short-term rentals tend to have a lot of cars that sometimes will show up to them. Is it
That's
something
not-
you guys have run out against before? And
Because there's no parking on the street. Like, and all you gotta do is walk around Waterville Valley, you can see the way the town is constructed.
Yeah.
There's no place to park on the road, so it's perfectly logical that there's no road parking.
Yeah.
It would simply block the road. And you couldn't get an emergency vehicle down the road. When there's an event or when somebody has a big party, you see this problem occur.
Yeah.
But this would be, you know, permanently somebody looking for a place to park unless there was specific, we gotta carve out a parking space for this ADU.
I want to push a little. on
But they
you
have
on
to
that.
anyway.
They can do that anyway.
They have to
Because
anyway.
Could do it,
there's no
yes,
maximum-
that's right.
There's no maximum limit.
We just had that discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I
Understood.
don't see how, I mean, I think lowering the floor just allows a property owner to say, I'm gonna build an ADU intended to be for a single person or a couple
And then,
with one vehicle. And that's what you're allowed to have if you're gonna rent by unit.
Mhm.
I mean, that happens, I think, in many communities.
Yeah.
So, but if they wanna build a second spot, they can.
I think
So,
sometimes, Mark, going off what you're saying, sometimes I've seen, it's a slightly different like application, but sometimes I've seen positions where you also just put in a little bit of a stipulation potentially in the rules or how you employ them to say that all cars must have an adequate and appropriate parking surface on the property.
Yep.
So that then if somebody starts parking on the lawn, because these are the things that then do happen, right? We all know things do happen, right? It's real life, right? And so people either start parking on the grass and that becomes an issue, right? Because they're like, oh, I can't park on the road. I got yelled at for doing that. Now I'm just gonna pull on the front lawn. You can put like a little asterisk or just sort of a stipulation that there is an appropriate parking surface for all cars on it. And to Mark's point, if you built it out and you only had one parking space on your property and you're trying to rent your ADU, you're either gonna find somebody who only has the one car, or if you can't rent it, then you might be like, geez, I think I do have to have two, and there'd be nothing stopping you from making it.
Okay.
But you guys could
And
have
I
a
think your
space.
suggestion is workable.
Yeah, because then you have a space to say your parking needs to still be suitable, right? This isn't sort of saying willy-nilly go forth.
Moving on.
Moving forward. Parking part 2.
Did we hear from the public?
Karen, there are only 6 people here.
Yeah, I know, and I heard skepticism about whether people would walk but in general, are the 6 people supportive of the amendment? Because that's, I mean, you heard there's a couple of planning board members concerned about it.
I think we've got a thumbs up. Yeah, you're a little
Okay.
distant on the screen, but so we're feeling good in the room, I think. And anybody who's not, shoot me a death glare right now. Okay. Important skill. So the next part of parking goes to some flexibility that exists in your ordinance today in the community. So today in Waterville Valley, you can get some parking flexibility approved. Not all of the parking for everything that gets built needs to be right on the site that it is. And in this case, what we see is there's 2 different scenarios. There's a distance you can be away from residential, right? So if the use is residential, those resident parking spaces have a 300-foot area they can be separated from. And it goes up to 1,000-foot buffer when we're looking at commercial. And so this map, I'll let Kat talk about maps because she's an amazing map maker and she makes them, so I'm not gonna take her glory. But do you want to just explain to them what they're seeing on that map?
Sure, so these are the 3 large parking lots that you have in town currently. And so I created 2 buffer rings around them for what is 300 feet, which is the yellow, and then 1,000-foot buffer is the blue. So that's, those walking distances from the parking lots and
So the idea on this one, what we're thinking here is adjusting the distance that offsite parking spaces can be from the primary use as a way to kind of align with those walkability goals we all talked about as being aspirational and not always aligned with our behaviors in the day-to-day. But the idea here is, are these distances the right distances, right? And this is sort of a tricky piece to think about, but it's interesting to me that the commercial spaces have such a further walkability distance than those residential spaces. To me, is kind of an interesting piece. I see the logic behind it a bit, right? Which is, I think I'm the queen of backfilling logic. You learned that about me. But when I try and think about what leads to something like this coming forward, the idea is that people want to be closer to their parking potential. If they have to carry things, if they live there, whatnot, right? They're loading and unloading things. If you're parking to go to dinner or go to the bookstore, you might be more willing to walk than if you say had all of your groceries and things to try and juggle in. But a lot of times, I think that distance is sort of interesting. It's a big gap between those, right? 300 feet for residential, 1,000 feet of flexibility for commercial. And we're going to flip to the next slide if we could, because this kind of puts it in context of a specific development site. So Kat, if you want to talk them through this one.
So this one we focused on Black Bear Lodge, since people live there full time and it's also a vacation spot. So that's the small dot there is the lodge. And so again, the yellow buffer is 300 feet and the blue is the 1,000 feet. And it also shows the proximity to those parking lots.
So I think that this is really where I think probably I want to talk most about that kind of walkability idea and what that idea of sort of a well-developed town center is, right? A lot of times what you end up seeing is the idea is, specifically when you don't have street parking, is to see concentrated lots where people know they can go for sort of parking, and then to see really leaning into that walkability piece, right? To see less and less space used all over the place for parking, right? There's a separation that happens visually when you group parking together. Your buildings can be tighter, makes them easier to feel more connected and walkable to each other when they don't all have to sort of have something in a certain closeness. And I think that there is space to potentially think about whether or not there's more flexibility you all want to be able to give.
I didn't want to tear my house down,
I want to tear your house down. Why do I want to do that?
because what you just did with Black Bear.
Why don't we let her finish her? Okay, hang on a minute.
Okay.
So, well, basically the idea here is there more flexibility you want the planning board to be able to use, right? And flexible parking plans are something that's approved by the planning board. And so the idea on this is, these are the numbers that are used today in the ordinance, the boundaries of how much flexibility can be given. But as we see sort of here, they're not always a great match, right? Sometimes there's something just a little beyond that might be perfectly fine from where something is. And maybe there is a little bit more flexibility you want the planning board to be able to have on a case-by-case basis to see that that parking could be potentially a little further away if there's a good plan for it, if there's a good connectivity, if it seems to work. The idea here is, I guess, not to give a carte blanche approval to things, but instead to just maybe think about whether or not that 300 feet residential parking and 1,000-foot commercial, are those really the boundaries that the planning board should be limited to at its most when you think about sort of how the pattern of development might occur in the community. The way offsite parking approvals work today is they have to sort of show a connection, right? Is that the way you all do it here? Let me ask everybody more like that. They have to show sort of an ability to use those lots or an access to some sort of like right to make sure that they have it contained, right? And the idea is basically making it easier for a property owner to say, well, if it was 350 feet away, but they felt like it could work, and there was a cooperating person who would let them use some space for parking there, you know, should the planning board be able to look at this more holistically on case-by-case basis, or should there be some sort of number here like 300? So why am I tearing down your house? What's going on?
I'm looking at what you just did, and when I look at the 1,000 feet, in order to have that parking, you're destroying my house.
No,
we would let.
But, you know, my other issue is this, all right?
Yeah.
Practical. As you pointed out, as we've pointed out, we don't have a lot of land available here. And the more you are allowing to spread out parking is less development of residential, commercial, stores, whatever. So I'm not sure I understand why we want to have more parking spaces and less residential or commercial stores.
I hear you on that. I think what
I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here. The joke was you're tearing down my house and John's house too. But realistically, all right, as I go back to the proposal that Terrell is doing, in order to maximize the development that they want to do of commercial as well as building various residential, they're talking about building garages in order to maximize what they can build. That goes against what you're talking about.
Well, but I guess I'd ask this is how would I be telling them they can't do that?
I understand. I don't even want to give them the option.
But I'd say, wouldn't that just be opening up the opportunity for somebody who isn't looking to build a parking garage to make an agreement with a neighbor who's a little further away than they could today? Because that's really all the nature of change we're trying to put forward here.
But I don't want, why do I want
This
to?
could also be, in regard to the distance the parking garage is from the new business. The amendment that the planning board's talking about would
Right.
say, well, here's some housing and there's gonna be a parking garage, but gosh, the best place for the parking garage is 350 feet away. Could we give the planning board the flexibility to do that on a special case-by-case basis?
So this isn't what currently is allowed, this is what you're proposing to be allowed?
No, so this is what's currently allowed, and the proposal is a little more open-ended than the other sort of specific numbers we put forward. Is the proposal really, the question tonight is really, should we switch to something where the flexibility given to the planning board to sort of do the case-by-case approvals doesn't have these exact hard number of limits on the top? So that they could say, if it was 350, say yes. If it was 500, it felt wrong, say, no, this sort of isn't a right connection, but that we don't have sort of that firm number as a high end limit at 300 feet.
Philosophically, the problem with that, to me, is it can put the planning board in an awkward position. If they're allowed to just
Arbitrarily.
set whatever limit they think is appropriate, as opposed to trying to abide by some limit.
Yeah.
So I don't know how, well, you guys are no better than I.
300 feet
that
is a
much
long
freedom.
way. 300 feet is
Football
football
field.
field. That's a pretty decent way. How far? If I look at Black Bear today. All right, and I go out to the utmost Black Bear parking lot. All right, we all know where that is, right? Is that 100 yards? I didn't think so either. All right, so basically. I find 1,000 feet. That's a long way away. I don't want to give up that kind of land that people can do things with. I don't. I think it's giving too much land away. I know what you're saying.
Yeah, no, but I'm curious, I want to understand more about the giving land away. Like, I guess I'm curious
I
because,
hate parking lots. I
I'm with you
love,
on
when it's a terrible thing, strange thing for me to say, since we just took that, since all the trees around us just came down. But I like trees, we like green. Right? I don't want to say we hate parking lots, that's, we don't hate anything. But, we try and, parking lots are there, we need parking lots. We need parking lots for our commercial development, we need them for our stores, we need them for our restaurants. Parking lots are very important for those things. But 1,000 feet, all right, and that's a huge amount of land that is being taken away in a town that has no land.
How's
so
it
1,000
taken
feet
away?
is what we have today, right?
Let's take
That's on the
Let's
rules
take
today,
1,000 feet of commercial,
right? And
only in commercial zone.
but I'm curious, how much have you guys seen loss of land to parking lots in that 1,000-foot radius so far?
No,
Mm,
Well, I would say,
I
when
don't. that's
you guys
true.
need to think about the map, right? And all of these parking lots that are in the middle of your town center. The proposal that we're talking about would have let you have the parking lots a little bit outside of the town center instead of right plunk in the middle of it.
yeah, to move them somewhere else is what this is about.
Right,
Where?
the current parking
Somewhere better.
situation is a function of these regulations.
Right.
And all we're saying is there a better way to use that land? Right, instead of having it as parking, which is required by the 300 and the 1,000.
Which is why they're talking about garages instead of parking lots.
Garages or parking somewhere else where it's not in the middle of where you're trying to have the commercial development, okay? Whatever it is, structured or somewhere else, it just the proposal would take away these limits. So that the planning board could say, hey, yeah, putting a parking lot over here, even though it's a big distance, whatever it is better than putting it within the 300 or 1,000 foot limit. They're just asking, the change would make it more flexible for the planning.
I
If you
understand.
wanted to put a lot up on Triple I Road and provide a shuttle
And
into
provide a
town.
shuttle, if that's what
That
the
would work.
business owner
Okay.
wanted to do, then, and the planning board agreed that that was a workable solution for the time that they were open,
Can't put it on
that would
Triple I-
be the flexibility that the
Triple I road
that the
is
planning board
Forest
would
Service.
have. That right now they don't have, that business has to have it within 1,000 feet. Or the residential development has to have it within 300.
Sometimes what you'll see is when you start leaning towards more flexibility. There is something that does sort of, I think, happen where the planning board can feel like they're in uncharted territories to decide what's appropriate and what's not, right? But there are other parameters we know about what makes something connected and feeling walkable and safeable than just linear feet or traveled, right? So if something's well lit, if there is a safe pedestrian connection between these things, be it a sidewalk or a bike path or a walking trail, if there's a shuttle service that's being provided, these are all things that can make us think pretty differently about that parking being appropriate or not. And one thing you can do is not necessarily just say, planning board, use the brain trust that you have and pick what seems right, and you'll certainly be correct. You can instead put parameters in there. There must be sort of appropriate connection, be it pedestrian or shuttle. There must be the parking plan must work, right? You must have a reason to think that this is a walkable, safe enough connection. It's not just, sure, it can be 700 feet away. 700 feet away, but then it leads the planning board to want to ask questions like, well, is there a sidewalk, a bike path? How will people move from place to place? Do we have some unloading spaces? Are there handicap spaces somewhere closer? And start to really think about just a little bit more intentionality and sort of where that parking is instead of just a linear foot as the crow flies.
Do we even know where these numbers came from?
I don't know.
There's-
Yes, I wrote that with the planning board a few years ago.
the 3,000.
And it was based on looking at maps, but since then, the gondola proposal has, seems to have some legs, and I haven't heard anybody mention that. If the skiers are parking up at the ski resort and they take the gondola down for dinner, why do you want to take up town center land for a parking space for that restaurant, for that skier?
So it's the principle of highest and best use and not confining the way the heaviest demand now, things have changed. So there's heavy demand for land. So we're not forced to park by numbers.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah,
And I think what maybe my notes, the planning board was leaning toward leaving these numbers in place, but writing into the zoning, something like a special permit that the planning board could grant, again, if there was a shuttle or a gondola or sidewalk.
So not throwing these out completely, but giving there to be a way out of them in the right situation.
That's the direction the planning board was leaning.
Yeah, what do you
Seems like a very interesting thing to be discussing, but I don't see how this is related to housing opportunity at all.
Yeah, so really what it comes down to is then if you're someone who's looking to build out in this area, and now you can sort of think about saying, well, you know what, I can have some parking over here and there. It's actually just going to make it easier to, in your tight area, see people maximize the development of land here with units. And then be able to put parking in other places that are right, instead of having to squeeze it right in there. So it kind of is basically, it's that same sort of highest best use, right? It's that density idea. It's that if you didn't have to, say, take a section of that lot right there and turn half of it into parking lot, but instead you could work with some folks, who have a little too much parking over here and get do something a little specific, right? the idea is that more of that space there in that town center can now be used for more units to fit on there, right? Because the other piece is when you have, now we're tying back to that 2 per unit number with the dwelling units. But when there's a certain number of parking you need per unit, and then you start thinking about that at multifamily projects, the impact of that parking is so much more than 4 cars, right? It becomes 40 cars or something, and that's a large amount of land area. A car in a parking space, usually a parking lot usually needs about 300 square feet per car to navigate and park per car. And so you actually, when you think about 400, you're actually talking about 1,200, square feet of area of that lot being used for it, which could, in footprint, thinking of building up 2 or 3 stories, fit 3 or 4 more units if the parking could be somewhere different.
So would that mean, for instance, if you wanted to use one of the, I don't know if the town owns this or if the resort does, but the parking lots that are typically empty away from the mountain, you could use those with shuttles and stuff, but you would need to expand this in order to do that?
Yeah, they need to create a provision in the rules that lets the planning board have more flexibility
Okay.
than those numbers, so that they could look at it in a proposal and say,
So it's
oh
getting more-
geez, look at this, you're now gonna have a gondola and you have this offsite parking area. Well, am I really gonna now make you build out all of this parking space right here? That seems silly now, right? More thoughts on parking, or we parking talked out for the moment? Parking talked out. All right, so our last topic of the night is density bonuses for PUDs, which are planned unit developments. So I'm going to define a couple of terms for us just real quick, so we're all playing from the same deck, and then I'll talk about the idea. A planned unit development is a development that's usually planned and constructed in sort of by one entity and one sort of intention. And there tend to be common themes about the lots or the units, but they're, instead of say one lot, one home, or a subdivision where different people come in to build the homes, it tends to be a developer coming in with sort of an intentional plan about how all of these things come together. Sometimes communities will end up starting to fold in density bonuses in the planned unit developments, because in nature of not coming in one-offs, they can sort of have a little bit more of a unique and intentional design to them, right? Instead of having one home with 20,000 square feet, a 20-foot front set, 35-foot front setback, 20-foot side setbacks. Instead, with planned unit developments, because it's sort of done in concert, there's a little bit more of an ability to say, lay them out in a slightly different way, right? Sometimes more intentionally. At the end of the day, they can create better laid out neighborhoods. And that's something that exists in the zoning today, right? Planned unit development provisions. A lot of Waterville Valley has actually, I believe, been built out through planned unit developments over the years. One specific type of planned unit development that's been sort of growing in popularity is this idea of cottage courts. And that's what there's actually a handful of pictures of on these slides. But cottage courts, they're like the San Francisco bungalow court. Right? They're this idea of smaller units for the homes, the square footage being smaller themselves. They tend to be sort of centered around like a shared common green space with parking behind. They tend to look a little bit like things like this, right? Central green space, smaller units, front porches facing each other, a little bit of neighborhood charm coming along. And one thing that we start to realize about cottage developments is because they have a small footprint, they don't always give somebody who's developing them the best bang for their buck, right? They are the square footage price, right? Anybody who's ever bought a home, the square footage price on those suckers can go high very quick because they're nice, charming neighborhoods. But even if you're building something small, if you still need 20,000 square feet, if you still need all these pieces, if you're a builder or a developer, you're a business, right? And your business is usually focused on trying to make sure you get a good profit out of it, which usually means you're actually probably going to build a bigger house on that because you can sell it for more, right? If I'm selling you something with 800 square feet, there's only so much I can really charge for that. If I build it at 16 or 2,000 or 2,500 square feet, there's a lot more I can earn from that, which pushes people towards building bigger homes. Bigger homes, more expensive homes. Common sense. So with the cottage developments, what we're starting to see happening in a lot of places is they'll start to say, you know what, when you're building smaller, things can be smaller. You can fit more units on there. We can up that density, because when that house is 1,000 square feet and not 3,000 square feet, turns out it doesn't need the same amount of space around it. And when it's in a planned unit development, it's got this intentionality to it, which sort of has the product coming along as a whole, right? The neighborhood's being put together intentionally as a group. And so it's not just these one-off pieces. And so the idea we have here is to provide bonus units or reduce minimum lot sizes for freestanding units in planned unit developments to encourage this type of building and make them a little bit more competitive. And I think this is one that makes a lot of sense to sort of talk through with like an illustrative example, which we have on sort of the next slide.
So this is a proposed plan that the planning board is probably familiar with. But it's a 1 acre lot in Waterville Valley, and you can see the different densities. So this one has 2 units on the lot. That one has 4 and then 6, and you can see how they would all sort of fit together and how much space is in between, depending on the density.
So what's kind of interesting, I think, to think about like this, when you can see it in kind of these concept drawings that were put together, is that what happens today is that, so even if this came forward as a planned unit development project, this is kind of what can fit on 1 acre today, right? There's 2 units. But if you were to say, build this out as like a multi-family development, right, where there were shared walls and units, they weren't freestanding, you actually would be able to fit this on the same lot, far more units, because there's a different density calculation that goes in when it's a multi-family building and when they're single buildings, which is this piece about trying to make those smaller cottage, single-family homes a little bit more competitive. So for today, if you own this lot, you could actually put a good number of units in here in a multi-family project. But if you wanted to have this aesthetic of the cottage courts we saw on that page before, you wouldn't be able to. So if I'm a developer and I'm running it through my pro forma little spreadsheet of numbers, even if I wanted to build one of these nice neighborhoods that I think would be a good fit in the community, I'm still going to lean towards that other type of building because I'm going to be able to get a better return on it, right? It's a safer bet for me to build that out. And so the goal here would be to try and level that field a little bit more by letting there be some density bonuses in your planned unit development, particularly for units that are of a certain size. Because today, even if it's a planned unit development, you need the same land area as you would as just an individual lot in your LDR zone. And so in this way, it's kind of an opportunity to say, instead of always seeing anything built at scale coming in bigger block style buildings, let's see if we can see it come forward in one of these cottage court styles that have a lot of charm to them, most people find. And so the idea here is to make that a little bit easier in those situations, to try and make it so that someone could say, actually, I can get my 12 units I need for return here in this nice little neighborhood layout instead, using the density bonuses in your PUD instead of putting them into, say, block apartment style, which maybe doesn't seem so inviting and charming. So that's kind of an idea that builds off of something we're seeing growing a lot right now in just the affordability move. We know across the board, household sizes are going down, right? They have been for decades in the US, right? People have fewer children, start later in life. And so in reality, there's a lot of demand for these smaller cottage style units and people downsizing and also just in smaller households coming along, period. So they end up being pretty attractive housing units at the end of the day for many people, because you're not sharing a wall, you're not listening to the neighbor's TV through the wall or anything like that, right? You feel like you have a little more autonomy in your space, a little bit more ownership over it. But it's keeping things small and sort of in a tight neighborhood so we can still try and let people reach some economies of scale when they're building.
So
What do you
what
think
kind
about
of
this?
zoning changes would be needed to implement this, to make this possible?
So if I can answer that with questions, maybe. So the planning board would need to amend the zoning to allow more than the 2 homes that are allowed right now. And the questions that I had in my notes from the planning board discussions and the board members there, feel free to hop in with additional questions, but would that make sense in some zoning districts, but not others? What's the right size? Is it the 4 homes or the 6? How small should these cottages in the cottage court need to be, or how big can they be? Are there design features that are the magic to making it work? Like if we go back to these slides, they're all a little bit different, but they have all some things in common too. So this is the concept that the planning board was least far along on and really had a lot of questions that we hope to learn something more tonight.
That's what was proposed a few
Yes.
years ago.
2019 and the town defeated it.
Soundly.
Absolutely.
But I think it's a great idea.
And that developer told us that he would build a multifamily unit if he couldn't do this.
That's why we got the multifamily building that we have now.
Doesn't mean we can't try again.
I think we should try again.
We should try, There we go. Fold
We've
that up
seen
as
it's
an
successful in a
example.
lot of other parts of the country too. It's
Yeah.
very successful in other parts of the country.
One thing I think I'm gonna jump on Tara's train here a little bit and say, so some of the questions I think become things like. When we're talking about them to you, do the design features feel like they matter? Because these are the pieces that sort of help us shape that regulation a bit, right? Is like she was saying, there is kind of a recipe for these things, right? They're centralized around a common shared space. They tend to have limitations on the size of the building, right? This is actually, the kind of thing that we draw up at work sometimes, right? But this concept of what it looks like, right? Individual spaces, some privacy in your backyard, a social area where all the front porches face together, parking in one space together.
Quite nice.
Right, so it's all these sort of pictures that come together, and so I guess some of the questions, I think the best way to work this through is in little questions, right? It's things like, does that magic sort of recipe there? Are there pieces of it that you think, are they important to keep? Because you can craft regulations that ask there to be some of these design features, right? You can also craft regulations that put a ceiling or a cap on the size of those cottage units like Tara mentioned. And these are all things that can help us see where, right? Is it LDR? Is it HDR? Is it anywhere they could show up, right? How do you all feel about that? Are there size limitations that you'd want to see? Is there something that feels too small or too big? Or do you have thoughts on that overall? How does that kind of recipe of design things piece? What are you guys gonna think about this as a whole, especially knowing it's something that's been considered before and maybe not put forward right to be received well, right? How could we come at it better this time?
Can you put a cap on the price of them?
Uh,
So that it's not outrageously expensive, you're
Making-
not putting in $500,000, $600,000 little units. Something that maybe people get in at a starting
Federal
price.
program,
When
maybe.
they go to sell, they're not allowed to sell it for more than a certain point, so you always have new homeowners going in there, so you've got affordable housing in the valley. If it's presented that way, it might be more appealing to a lot of people.
That's something we could look at.
Yeah, those are federal programs that are very complex.
They can, there's some ways you can do it, but I'll be sort of honest with you and just really sort of talk it through with you a little bit the way I see it. And what I see a lot of times in it is that the mechanisms to make all that go can get so hard that making the change takes quite a bit of time, right? Because in reality, there's ways like there's a zoning tool called inclusionary zoning, which in New Hampshire is something you can put forward where you can say, if you are going to ensure these are at a certain affordability price tied to like the average incomes in the county, then you can get density bonuses, but only if they're affordable. And it's not something you can force somebody to do in New Hampshire, but it's something, it's a carrot you can put out there for them of saying this is only available if a certain number of your units hit this threshold or something. But I'll be honest with you, those are they tend to be pretty unpopular and very hard to get through. And so it's something you can think about. It might make it a little tougher, but it's something that I think could be thought about.
I think Dover, New Hampshire might have done that because they're seeing a lot of these going now.
Yes, and I actually am good friends with the planner in Dover, and that's exactly how they do that.
But it's gonna depend upon the value of the land, I mean.
Yeah.
If a developer is willing to keep a price point at a certain level, as opposed to, well, I'll just build a multifamily unit building here and sell them for $800,000 a piece. That's what you're competing
Right,
with.
exactly. You're always kind of in that.
So
in
how do you
that
sweeten
balance.
it enough? So that it's selling it for 400,000. I don't see how that and the
Who are you
value.
limiting it by?
Hmm?
And who are you limiting it by that? You allowed to keep out of staters who are only gonna come up here, you know, a couple of months out of the year? I mean, you can't limit buyers. Like, you can't say this is only for people who are willing to work in the valley, because it just doesn't work that way.
That's kind of illegal.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think we actually kicked that to a lawyer who informed us that that's not gonna be a flyable
But
option.
if you have to, then, you know, if you have to show limitations, minimums, maximums, whatever, you're kind of forcing the developer into a certain type of home, which is naturally, I think, gonna be more affordable
Yeah,
in the long run.
no, and I
You know,
agree with that. I
that's-
just don't see it benefiting the housing issue that we're having with the people that we need in the valley in order to maintain the valley on the level that we want to. Like, I just see it becoming more of these people coming in and buying those and only being here.
Well, we kind of have this Mountain Village South, which is the little cluster of homes across from the school.
Okay, yeah,
Those are kind of like this type of a setup where those are individual lots.
Yeah.
With a very small home. Dimensions were, I don't know how they did it back
Yeah.
when those were built,
There
but
aren't
those
many
were
of those.
built as the models for the condos. So if you look at them, it's like a single condominium from Noon Peak condos. And it's set as its own, so they were using them as models, and then they turn them into homes. But it would be the same idea, you know, close in
Yeah.
dimensional requirements and setbacks. And those sorts of things are different. That's what a PUD would be.
Yeah.
It's like, the question is, where do we allow them? What's that minimum building size that you would be.
Land
looking
use and
for?
setbacks.
Yeah, land use and setback.
and I think the community might be more open to it if they knew, because the most what I hear from people that I talk to in the valley is, when they're complaining about, you know, the new roads now, it looks too urban like, or what some of the proposals that they're making in town square, it's taking away the charm. So I actually think you could try to sell this as keeping the charm. So like, I think that would be one way to market it, to get people to pass it, because I think, like I said, it's about the people are here and what they want to say is that part of it.
From what we're hearing for people that are coming in to potentially take a job, you know, they don't want to live in a townhouse. But if there was a single family home that was the same size,
Right, like little
they
small
might,
tiny houses.
smaller houses or.
Yeah, don't say
whatever,
tiny
that a
houses.
family. Yeah. don't say that. But-
Cute
but
cottage.
Something, yeah, but something that
Something like
gives
Cottage.
them, that gives them their own place with their own
Right.
piece of land, then I think it becomes more attractive
Mhm.
to those folks that we're trying to recruit.
There's a disincentive that some communities are considering for these too, and that's to not allow them to be short-term rentals.
Mhm.
And that's a stipulation that's
Seeing more
easier
and
and
more.
clearer to put forward than, than like something like we were talking about.
And we're seeing, as you know, Mark, and as well, knows, we're seeing more and more condo associations. All right, putting limitations on 14 days, and that's what's 30 days of that you had to rent in order to do it, to avoid Airbnbs or whatever you want to call them. That are seeing more and more of that happen around town too.
So let me ask you guys on this idea of where in town. This is something that, I mean, like tools like this, right, are things that can get used largely anywhere in town today, right? PUDs are allowed anywhere today. So are there any places where you would not want to see this sort of cottage development where it would feel maybe out of place with what's around it or not?
LDR.
LDR?
It's LDR, that's not what it was designed for. That's not what the people that live there expect. All right, I would think.
But it would certainly fit in VC.
Yeah.
It would fit in high density.
Yeah.
But high density, not almost wall to wall condominiums. And it would.
Well,
it
that's
would
the
look-
competition I was talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would look unusual as well.
But in a
VC
redevelop, the key in the vast majority of what you talked about is really in a redevelopment environment. In a redevelopment environment in HDR, this makes a lot of sense. Even maybe behind, I hate to say behind me, but even behind me, which is not what Terrell is planning, but even behind me, that is something that could work instead of what we built. I didn't build it, obviously, but that's really, this is really a great redevelopment methodology in HDR. I think would really work there, which is, a while
It's
down
gonna
the road.
require some pretty hefty incentives. I mean, the market is showing us what's going on now.
No, I agree.
What's going on now are building $1 million or $800,000 condominium units.
Yeah, you know what's going on in my area, so.
And I'll say with my kids too. That's more what they're leaning towards now too. They want things more simplified. They want condominiums and
Mhm.
shared spaces and everything.
Sure.
Generation.
Well, especially, again, we're a resort community, especially if it's your
Yeah.
vacation home. You don't want to be dealing with lawns and
Yeah.
all that stuff. You just want to,
But the PUD can be condominium.
oh, yeah, yeah.
It
And
is.
it has.
Yeah,
We
sure.
have.
But would you replace the small cottage thing in like a condominium area? Because then you're decreasing housing. So like, how does that?
That's the incentive I think I was trying to get at. I mean, for a developer, they're looking at the profit of building a multi-unit. I mean, this was the whole issue at what went up and what's now the villas of Waterville Valley.
Yeah.
The developer presented the planning board with a cottage court type development. I forget how many, 8 or
Yeah.
Yeah.
12 or something like that, but we needed.
6, this is the drawing of it. It was
That
6.
was it, right.
Yeah.
So, and it required a lot coverage and setback change, if I recall.
No density. The
Density.
zoning only allowed 2 units and 6 was what they needed to come out equal with what they did.
And a town vote in 99, we took it before the town. I think we were going 6,000-7,000 square feet that they were allowed, something like that. Went down hard. We saw what we have on basically, is that an acre that has 12 units, something like that?
Mhm.
And you see what they are. I don't think a lot of us are happy about it,
Right.
but that's what we have. What it is.
Any other thoughts on where? So let's think about your neighborhoods. Are we all kind of in agreement on this? Where? Anyone have sort of a different look on it?
I'm trying to understand this notion of redevelopment. And most of the condo associations are not terribly old. So I'm trying to imagine in what era it might happen that a decision will be made to tear all those down.
It's not in your lifetime or mine.
I can't visualize that.
It's not your lifetime or mine.
Long time, probably, right? Like if, like you're saying, if things are in good condition, then likely a long time, right? And so to that end, if you like this tool, it's about making sure it can show up in a wide enough space that it can show up, right?
I guess I'm optimistically hoping that there's some way that we can improve the housing problem here
There is.
this century. You know, if we're talking about, you know, lifetimes, within the time that we're talking about, there are inconceivable changes that will occur to zoning. And that makes me question that, what are we talking about here?
These things don't take forever to happen, but I think what in reality it comes down to is because it comes down, particularly when it's redevelopment, it comes down to a property owner running into a problem or some reason that they're going to do something differently. You can't forecast them, right? So like, I would be very foolish to stand here and be like, oh, within 5 or 6 years, I bet you'll get 1 or 2 of these to come through. Maybe you won't, but also maybe you'll find that somebody's actually battling a major mold issue inside of the walls of a building that wasn't well constructed in 1976.
You make a good point.
And so it's always kind of like it's because I feel very much like you do as somebody who works in this space a lot. It's you'd like to see that the change we make makes impact, but it's very hard because we are very, very rarely the ones who will do the building of the change, right? And so,
You're
But-
young.
yeah, right.
If the
Compared to
zoning,
us.
if the zoning ordinance is already set up to allow it, that could be an inducement
Exactly. Give
to
somebody
renovate,
something.
rebuild too.
Well, in reality, right, I think about having worked in places with pretty busy development pieces before. What I end up finding is if somebody owns something that say, let's be honest, things that were built in the 70s, I will throw the shade that should be thrown on that. There's some stuff that's not aging well. I don't see them large buildings or small. And I think if you are somebody who has one of those buildings, you probably the first phone call you make when you think you need to do something different or something's going to have to give here pretty quick is probably to an engineer or somebody who helps you see what can happen. And having been the planner in towns, I'll tell you the first thing the engineer does is crack open that zoning book and say, what can you do without needing to get any special passes from anyone? What do we know you can do here? And the more creative options you let them have, the more space they have to do it. Doesn't mean they will, but it means that they don't, it means that the professional they call first doesn't tell them not to pursue it from the gate because it's going to be harder, right? You create the path for it. And then I think the other piece, I'll just sort of say on the changes as a whole is there's an opportunity that came with this, all of this work we're doing together is through some funding that the state of New Hampshire put into really looking at this, and it doesn't come along every day. So when there's an opportunity, even if it's paving the way for something we don't know may happen in the future, we kind of have an opportunity now to try and move what we can.
Charles, just to give you a little idea, there's 7 acres of land right up behind us. That someday may come up.
Yeah.
That everyone wants to bid on. So you just don't know where something like this. could
5,
go.
6 years from now.
I have a question, maybe it's more towards the planning board people too, but like. Say there's some type of natural disaster, like up by West Branch Road, River Road, so you have the middle section of River Road there where it's the U. And say 2 or 3 of, or all 3 of those houses are destroyed, and a developer comes in and buys them. So if we pass this, can they put something like number 6 in there? And the residents have no say over it, or is it already zoned? a certain
No, it's
way that they
LDR.
can't do it? It's because it's LDR.
It's LDR, you need a half
Okay.
acre to build a home,
Okay, that's what I,
Right.
but.
and
I
no
was wondering how
multifamily
much of
homes are allowed.
These changes would affect a neighborhood like that, because. Grant, I understand what you're saying, and but there's so much limited space. And that's where I think the difficulty in trying to grasp it and understand it is because we are so limited. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But you're really trying to figure out like, how is this really gonna benefit us?
Yeah.
And
And how might it impact you too?
Yeah.
Right? You know, there's always both that sides to that coin to think about.
The only feasible place for this to even work would be in LDR, because you have the larger lot sizes today, and financially, you know, let's say it's a $1.3 million home or whatever. If you could build 6 of those on there and get back to that 1.3 and higher, would incent the developer, right, to actually try to tackle that. That's what's happening in Dover. They'll take an old farmhouse that's been there since 1800 and tear that sucker down and build 6 of these units in there because the costs.
Yeah, but they're not doing that on an acre, they're doing that on multiple acres when they're building. And how many
They're
empty lots are
actually-
there in LDR? And those lots are selling for what, $450,000?
No, I'm saying, so we have some homes that were built in 1970, whatever, that are probably got mold in them that. If someday someone wanted to say, yeah, I could take this acre lot that I have and. Turn it into 6 of these things, I could do it financially. Because that's the only way anybody's gonna do any of this stuff, that make somebody some money or at least break even on it. That's my.
Yeah.
What's interesting in Dover is that they're actually doing it in really small lots.
Yeah.
They're doing it as like an infill project, and so. They do a lot of community salesmanship to the neighbors when they come in about what's gonna make this work. I think there's a lot of like pony trading between the developer and the neighbors that's been happening in Dover to make it. Make it work for everybody, but they, I think, fit. 42 or 62 units on just over 3 acres on an oddly shaped lot, and when you go in there.
They did 12 or 4 or 14 units on an acre.
I will
So that's
tell you.
like 3,000 square foot lot.
And what's interesting is they didn't do individual lots, right? It's a whole different kind of, they don't have individual lot size requirements, so they're all just kind of condominiumed or owned by somebody who's renting a bunch of them out, and they're clustered. And so there's these little, basically walkable cul-de-sacs with like 6 of them right around. And in reality, when I went to tour the space in between the front doors is literally from me to you.
That's no
Across.
different than some of our
Yeah.
HDRs.
Yep, and it's just, and so they actually are getting very good at fitting these into small spaces, and to your point of saying on 1 acre, I could put 6 of them, that would be interesting. So size, I think, is a piece that I'm gonna kind of just feed them some things, and you guys disagree with me, because we'll find out where the voters all disagree eventually and agree, right? So let me start throwing things out. A lot of times we'll look at cottages and say, the size of them, if you're gonna get a density bonus, is something like, on the high end, I've seen some go, seen some people push for 1,600 square feet, which feels big to me. I've heard 1,200 square feet as sort of a size that still seems small enough that it works. I used to live in a 1,200 square foot house just by concept. It gave us 2 pretty smallish bedrooms, a little office, and a reasonable space, right? We could fit in there. Sometimes we see that number go smaller, right? Down to say 1,000 square feet as the total footprint allowed, or 800 square feet, even if you want them to say very small. But when I start saying things like 1,200 square feet, does anybody start feeling like, geez, we're getting a little big here? Or is that seeming like maybe something in line?
Just to put in perspective, 12 North Face. All right, everybody knows North Face, right? North Face units, base units are approximately, I believe, 1,200 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 2 baths.
Perfect, good visual.
What? I think that's what North Face is.
Tri-pyramid is 1,250.
Yeah.
2 bedrooms, 2 baths.
So 1,200, that's about 1,200 square feet.
Perfect for 2 retired people. They're awesome.
Or like I
Awesome
honestly,
retired
my
people.
husband and I, we had 1,200 square foot house, 2 beds, 2 baths. It was perfect for us. Literally, we would have stayed there forever. We hated the town, so we left.
Not great for a family.
No. Nope, not great for a family. So
All right.
this,
So you question.
Depends where you
Come.
grew up, Mike.
What?
Right.
That's true. Wait a minute. That's true. I mean, well, I grew up in a small 3-bedroom colonial on 5,000 square feet.
Yeah.
All right, and on whatever that.
That was about 4,000 more square foot than I had.
But yeah, I mean,
You
the
can put
question
families,
becomes,
you can put families.
what are we trying to build? Are we trying to build more 1,200, 13,000, 1,200, 1,300 square feet for retired people? Or are we trying to build something that a family of four
I
appropriate?
don't think you can approach it that way. Mike.
Well, yeah, but except a family of four probably needs a couple, 1,400-1,500, maybe?
They probably need that third bedroom, right?
That's why I was getting up
Yeah.
15,
And
14.
why do you need to do a cookie cutter?
Well, and that's the piece is you could literally start, set a number that seems reasonable, like 14.
I'm just
Yeah.
saying, what do we, when we're talking about this. And we're talking about who do you want to build for?
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
within those communities, you could have an 800 square foot and a
Okay.
1,500 square
Yeah.
foot, couldn't you?
It's,
Depends on the lot, like how you
Yeah.
can
You could
configure.
build them different
right,
sizes.
it's not who you're building it for, it's the price point you're looking for.
Yeah.
We're not trying to debate these numbers now.
Right.
We're just trying to say, is this concept
Exactly.
viable?
Right, we like the
Number-
concept.
Say that sounds very wrong.
Waste a lot of time. talking.
Right, it's a
Choose
fine,
smaller
it's a
one.
fine concept.
All right. Do we like the design pieces of it?
Yes,
Yes, we're going.
Yeah,
All right. Other thoughts on this?
we love it.
what are your thoughts? I'm enjoying what your perspective is.
On the cottage parts and the planned unit development?
Sure.
I mean, I think that they are something that's really just weirdly popular with two very different demographics right now. I think they're very popular with people a little younger than me, maybe more like Kat's age, and also with people who are aging and starting to downsize. And it's
Sure.
mature, our wiser folks and our less experienced wild folks. But I think that there's weirdly a piece where, like I said, we've seen the average household sizes coming down for decades in our country, right? We tend to have one or two kids.
Here,
We tend to have one or two kids. Yes, but it is here too. That same trend we see, the average household sizes have gone from over 3 to now like 2.45 people per household. And with it, I think that the idea of letting there be some mix to it is great. I think what you're trying to ultimately avoid is just feeling like you're in a neighborhood that feels too tight, right, when it comes to size. But I think that there's space I like the idea of having variety. I think when these are best, they do have variety. It's not the same 800 square foot
Yeah.
thing stamped down 15 times, right?
Yeah, that's just tract housing.
Yeah, but something that gets a little bit more at the average or the total average of square foots is something, right, where there can be some flexibility.
So one last question. While we have you here with your expertise, do you have any suggestions on how this kind of a concept can be sold to a community like this that has so many mixed opinions and perspectives? How can we get this through the next time we try it? What are some of the different approaches to make this sound more appealing to a lot of the voting?
We say we didn't do it the last time and look what we got.
exactly,
This time we're gonna do it the right way.
right.
And that's why, what is the right way to try to solve this?
What- Just what it's sold.
I'll be completely honest with you. I think there's a little bit in that boat. I would say there's
Yep.
some honest to sort of proof is in the pudding. You all
Yeah.
have seen the way this plays.
Right.
But I also think the other piece is the spots that we just talked about the fact that these make nice neighborhoods. And then at the end of the day, when we start thinking about housing production, I think what people get most concerned about is that we're just going to start trying to pump out as many units as possible and as many people in a way that starts to erode what feels special about our places. And this, on the other hand, is something that says you need to create special communities, but those special communities, they can be a little bit different. They can be a little bit tighter. And so I think it really is about sort of trying to get to that point of selling to people that this is something that creates nice neighborhoods. It's not fundamentally going to change how many neighbors could go in next to you because it could go in as a multifamily development with that many, but it's going to make what we find is these make neighborhoods where people have privacy, independence, shared space, a little bit more communal nature and a little less neighbor to neighbor tensions.
Maybe the way to sell it, maybe the way to sell it is honestly, we've been here for a while. My folks have been here since 1981. There is such a scarcity of neighborhood feeling in Waterville Valley. We live in Noon Peak, and most of the time, there are these huge condo buildings, empty parking lots, except on ski weekends. We're typically almost the only it's like a ghost town.
Yeah.
Talk about neighborhood. It's in some ways we like it. We're sort of hermits. But there's no neighborhood feeling. And maybe that's something that could be made more appealing to more of the community. I don't know.
This is conceptually closer to what the image of Waterville Valley is.
Yeah, it is.
You can also perhaps help it along by restricting initially to certain zones like HDR. We already have that. That's
Philosophy.
maybe VC, although we tried this in VC and it failed.
Not much left in BC.
But again, it's more perhaps redevelopment too.
But I think that's really true, you know, I think a lot of times. We're skeptical of change, it's our nature, I think most of us as people, and if you open the door for something in a reasonable amount. And you let yourself say, see that it doesn't come forward. Sometimes you learn a lot by letting something happen and seeing that nobody wanted to do it anyway, right? And you have to look at why not. But at the same time, maybe you get one project that does come along in the next few years that becomes something that people can go, oh yeah, that was okay. Maybe we're okay letting this happen a little bit wider of an area. Suddenly, this doesn't seem like some unknown thing somebody wrote in text to say, thou shalt be able to build 1,200 square feet in 3 units. And instead it looks like that thing. What you all just did tonight is the magic of community, is you point out things each other know, right? An example of what's 1,200 square feet, what's that thing, what's that near, what's this? When you see that in your community, if you open the door a little bit, you might find that you suddenly build more buy-in for this and you say, heck, we could let it happen here. Maybe this would be okay too. It's okay to take little steps. So,
Special civic too. Another good zone, potentially.
Tara, do we want to go to our next slide?
No. No.
Okay, so next steps. I will introduce nothing more to you tonight. What I will say is, where do we go from here, right? So we're going to think about kind of what has moved forward in the evolution of this conversation. The planning board's been at this for a little while on these pieces with Tara, Kat, and I. So now we'll pull kind of a little bit of a wider group into this, what we heard tonight. We're going to make some changes, right? We're going to sort of see what's exactly right. We're going to look about holding a second public hearing if necessary, right? Hold a public hearing, get sort of through the meat and potatoes of the changes. And then we're gonna, so those are some of the change pieces, right? And we're gonna get those ready between now and town meeting time. That's kind of how this goes, right? There's a process. You'll hear the public meetings happen as we head into the winter, things kind of lock down for the ballot, and then we go to our vote in March. But separate from that, we're gonna continue us as the consultants, but also the landowner. I know you all are aware of the idea of this workforce housing development in the White Mountain National Forest. There's a lot of community conversation about it. We've heard we do actually have part of this project to have us continue to help work in that space as that moves forward, to help look at the concept plans, what can work in that space, because we recognize, right, that the opportunity bet, it's a slow bet, and it's a one that we don't know the change that comes tomorrow from, but we know something about that project being proposed. So we will sort of continue to participate in that as it moves at its pace. And then there's some other topics that are being talked about by the planning board. I know very little about these, so I'm just going to mention them, that on November 8th at 6 p.m. other zoning amendments are going to sort of be discussed. We kind of talked specifically about these housing pieces tonight.
Yeah, there's 5 other.
Yeah, and what I know, what do we have? Special events, EV charging, solar, wind.
That's it.
The floodplain
Black sky.
and dark sky, was that one?
No, there's no changes proposed on the dark sky.
No.
Special events, EV charging, solar, wind, floodplain. No, I'm missing one.
No, you're not.
I'm sure there's 5.
Yeah, I read them.
Or 5.
There are 5.
There are 5.
You said 5.
They're relative.
Oh,
they're
solar and wind
relatively-
is separate. That's
Yeah,
right.
they're relatively
Anyway.
not a lot of discussion.
So on this train, the last thing I'll say is, you all know that there is a YouTube channel, right? You all keep a YouTube channel. So if you have neighbors, friends, anybody else who you think would have some interest in this, tell them to watch the video. If you have the handout and you want another one, we have some other ones. If you want to share it with somebody else, if you have people who have questions who, aren't in the room, and a lot of people aren't, that's the way these things usually go, but spread the word about what's being talked about. Ask people to reach out if they have questions so that we can help kind of make sure that people understand what the goal of them is, what the level of change being thought about is, and we'll keep moving things forward from here.
Is it online?
Yes.
Yeah.
There'll be.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
both.
Good.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
all.
Maybe we can put some of those in the post office. Front and the front,
Keep those all
Yeah.
here.
yeah,
and
that Mark will.
We'll send you a PDF if you haven't yet.
No.
And I'm not spending any
Thank
more
you,
of my
Tara.
money.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.